Welcome to Jargon, a podcast bringing clarity to commonly misunderstood business concepts. We're debunking and simplifying the buzzwords and ideas plaguing today's business world and offering a fresh perspective on these topics.
Hello, this is Bill Aimone.
And this is Peter Purcell.
Welcome to our podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about something really interesting. We want to first define what it is before we dive in, but we're going to talk about AI today, and we're going to talk about AI hallucinations.
Yeah, so AI hallucinations, they sound really interesting or very ethereal, but isn't it just AI giving you a wrong answer?
Okay, so people like to put the word hallucination on the word AI because like a person might hallucinate something, like wake up one day and think the sky is purple or something, or maybe they took some mind-altering drugs or something. Whenever I think of hallucinations, I think of the 60s and people taking LSD, but that's not really what we're talking about here.
That'd be more interesting.
Perhaps, but I wouldn't advocate for that at all. But they talk about AI hallucinations. You're absolutely right. You nailed it. It's when AI gives a incorrect answer.
Or it makes up an answer. Like, for example, lawyers early on using AI would ask for precedent cases, and they didn't realize that GPT was creating fake cases to support their answer. And that did create some issues.
Yeah, and it really goes back to, do you believe everything that you read on the internet? So, for example, you might ask a set of questions and AI might believe everything they're reading on the internet. So someone might have an article about something on a website and the AI web scraper went and pulled that information and said, this is true. From a human reasoning perspective, you could go to that website and see that this was just marketing stuff that somebody made up, or it was just maybe a website just for SEO purposes, and that's all.
So I guess my question is, now that we've defined what an AI hallucination is, how do we go about preventing them or reducing the chances of them? You know, you mentioned going to a website, so I'm assuming it has something to do with, making sure that your data is good, and then you can correct AI, right, if it's wrong. But I think there's more to it than just that, right?
Yeah, there is. And let's really talk about why these hallucinations happen, first of all. I'll use the best analogy. Think about a new hire into your company. They're brand new and they're given all sorts of information. So during orientation, they're given information about benefits. They're given orientation information about safety, what to do and not to do. But as they start to meet people, they'll meet someone in the organization who may be a disgruntled employee, or they've got wrong information about the company and they tell them something that's not true about the company. And so when you start feeding a person or even an AI model bad information, they're going to act on that information. So, for example, a new hire comes into the company and somebody says, our ERP system's terrible. It's awful. Well, automatically that person is going to have a predisposition to thinking that ERP system's terrible. So when they're encountered with it, they may not trust its reliability and the information it's giving them because they heard that from somebody. And that's similar to what an AI model does. It heard something on the internet or heard some data that somebody fed them and it's incorrect, but they're using that to then give you an output and an answer.
Well, you use the term data. So, Bill, let's go down that path a little further. To me, it seems that the core of AI, right, getting good answers, it's not just the tools, it's not just the learning, but the start is data. It's all about what you're inhaling, what the AI engine is inhaling, what you're putting through your...
You use the word inhaling, and we're talking about hallucination.
Very good. Thank you. I'm glad you caught that. But again, all joking aside, it seems like it starts with data. Is that true, or am I oversimplifying?
Well, it does. It starts with information, okay? Because sometimes when people think data, they think of a big, huge database of numbers and stuff. It could be text files. It could be PDFs. It could be a database. There's information that's being fed to that AI model that informs it, and that gives it the outputs they produce back to you.
Okay. So if we start with data, and we make sure that data is good, data is properly chunked and all of that, what's the next level or next layer that really matters to make sure that AI is still performing and giving you accurate answers?
Yeah. So let's think about if you're an organization, and let's suppose you're a manufacturing company, because really we're talking to people who are inside corporations thinking about AI and are the biggest negative that people are concerned about AI, and the reason why they don't want to embrace it They'll say, we're afraid of hallucinations. We don't want AI to give us the wrong information because I just happened to see when I did something on ChatGPT, it gave me the wrong answer. So if we use AI inside our company, we're going to get wrong answers. So that's really the inference here. And that's why we're talking about this, because there's a lot of internal resistance to it in companies because they're afraid of that. Now, there's a risk associated with that. We'll talk about the risk later, but let's just talk about how to address those specific.
And that would be my question, because, somebody off the top of their head would say, okay, well, create a RAG, right? In other words, create your own internal environment, control your data yourself, maybe just ingest data from the internet, as needed. It sounds too simple.
Well, let's back up a little bit. Okay, let's think about your AI model. So you've heard terms like training an AI model, sort of like training your employees. So the first thing you're going to want to do is isolate your AI model. So you can decide to have that AI model hosted in the cloud. They can have it, their large language model hosted locally, but really isolating it from the world. So, for example, today when you go onto ChatGPT or Gemini and you ask a question and it gives you the wrong answer, that wrong answer is not only informed by the data that they've gathered, but it also is an aggregation of feedback people have provided and said, that's the right answer. You know how you can give the thumbs up or thumbs down?
Yeah.
And provide comments? Yeah. It's taking that information in batch, not real time, but in batch mode to say, hey, when we gave this answer, everybody said it was wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, some bad actors could be saying that's wrong when it's really right. So how many times have you gone into ChatGPT and asked a question and there's some bias in there? Well, that bias is generated either by whoever initially trained the model or the feedback that's provided in that model. So if you think about it, bringing a large language model in-house and isolating it from the data that sits out there in the world where it could be influenced. So if you have an employee that comes into your company and let's suppose everybody thinks your company's a terrible company out in the outside world, you want to isolate that employee from knowing that your company's a terrible company, if it were, suppose.
Okay. So essentially you're putting guide rails up.
You're putting a ring fence around it.
A ring fence, guardrails, yeah.
And so what you want to do then is at that point, now I've got my model, I've got it isolated, start training it with your internal data. So there's a lot of ways to do it. You mentioned RAG, so that's retrieval augmented generation. That's basically a methodology for retrieving information to generate a model and a response in an AI environment. So, for example, you may start to give it specific instructions, just like you train an employee to say, we're a manufacturing company. These are the things we do. Here are the products we produce. Here are the specifications of these products. Providing enough context around what your foundational information is. So earlier when I said data, there's also information about your company. I could load in every single bill of material, manufacturing, production, transaction into an AI model. But if I don't explain to that model the context and what things mean, there's anomalies, there's things that happen out there. The model might look and say, December 25th of every year, there's no production. We need to tell the model that's Christmas holiday, that's a day off. But if you don't, they're going to think something weird happens when the number 25 shows up in a calendar. And they don't know that that's a company holiday. So there's all those specifics and information in combination with your data that you need to train your model around. So that's the basis to prevent the hallucination so it knows what things mean inside your company. And, the best way to do that is think about it this way. If you're going to talk about your company, we tell people just sit down for 30 minutes and record a transcript of you talking about the company and what it does and all the things that happen around a production shop floor process. Take that, transcribe it, load it into your model, and that becomes some of the information it uses to be able to inform the model.
So learning, the whole learning model then should not be an onerous effort, then it sounds like. I mean, it's a matter of you giving it data and information. It's telling it what the context is around that data and information. And then it's allowing it to learn. Then you can query it and correct it it almost sounds exactly like training a new analyst or a new employee. It's almost like the same set of steps.
It is. But the thing about AI is I'm going to give it access to all that data at once.
Right.
And so, for example, I might have structured data that's in my ERP system or our manufacturing system.
Or unstructured data in contracts.
Right. For example, I might have internal documentation on policies, procedures that are in PDFs that talk about our procedures and what we do. I might have engineering drawings and specifications that talk specifically about our products we make and what do they look like? What's important about our products? Is it strength? Is it quality? What are the things that are important about our products that make it a quality product?
Okay, so I'm elephant in the room, right? You mentioned, bringing it in-house. In today's world, everybody's talking about putting systems to the cloud, right? Is this one of the rare moments where sometimes bringing it in-house is the right answer? Or can I bring it in-house in the cloud and give myself like those guardrails that we were talking about? I mean, what is that? I'm not trying to get into an architecture discussion, but I can just see our listeners going, hey, wait a minute. I thought this was all to be in the cloud.
It's both. I mean, you can have the environment in a secure environment via AWS or Azure cloud. You could do that. You just got to think about data storage, data capabilities, and what you want and how much you're going to use. But you also want it connected to your systems. So you got to look at your internal architecture, what you have today, the security you have, and make that decision based upon your internal preference. I would just tell you with the computing costs and everything and the challenges a lot of these data centers are having, you're probably going to want to use, if you're decent sized company, use an enterprise level AWS or Azure, but you could bring it in house if you have those capabilities. It's not that hard to do is the bottom line.
Okay. So once you get this in, you have your own kind of ring fenced environment, you put in data, you put in information, you've taught the engine, you've taught AI interacting with it. Talk a little bit about how do you interact with this beast and what happens if it hallucinates? What do you do there? Because you could still have, to your point, that December 25th, that could create a hallucination.
There's unknowns. There's going to be something that comes out of it. So that's the whole rollout process. First, people need to understand AI is not going to replace people. The reasoning within AI is so far down the horizon that we're not even talking about that here. You still need someone to make the decision. AI makes recommendations, but you, the human, need to make that decision. So the human is going to have to look at the outputs and discern and say, okay, this output makes sense given all the information I've given this, but there may be some human reasoning that you cannot put in that AI model that you've got to take in consideration. So you're not completely leaving it up to the AI model. Like in the self-driving world of cars, you can put no human in that car and let it go. Okay, and we all know
it'll drive around in a circle forever because there's no human being in there to correct it. Hey, you got kind of in a loop. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that could happen. But to steer it out of the reasoning-wise,
occasionally you need to put your hand on the wheel.
Yeah, just understand it's not going to replace humans. I think the other piece that I want to cover on that too is I've trained the model, but I also want to have, you can't just train it and leave it alone. Okay. And this is where you've heard Peter use the word RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. This is where you're constantly updating the model based upon new information in the company. Okay. So what that means is if I've got a manufacturing execution system that has data in it, I'm going to want to have hooks into that to retrieve that data on a regular basis, because as soon as something changes on the shop floor, let's say a specification around a certain product changes, you want the LLM to pick up that updated information almost real time, but in a daily basis. So that model's being trained on the latest and greatest information.
All the time.
All the time. And that's where RAG comes into play, being able to constantly retrieve the information and keep the models trained on the new information. So informing the models to say, this is what you do when new information comes in, and this is how you treat it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I guess that brings up the question of, I'm going to use the term governance, but really, who babysits this? Like, who makes sure that it is learning correctly? Who makes sure? It sounds like there needs to be some sort of, we talk about guardrails, right? We talk about ring fencing, But who watches that it's within the guardrails? Who's watching that it's learning correctly? Who's watching that it's being trained correctly? How does all that work, Bill?
Yeah, Peter, that's a really good question, and this is probably the most difficult piece out of all of it, because this becomes the interaction between the results, the human interpretation of what's happened, and what the AI model produces, and what do you do with that information? How do you use it? How do you control it? And how do you prevent a failure in the company? So in the healthcare industries, it's huge. The repercussions could be huge if you've got an incorrect response out of an AI model, and it gives a
wrong diagnosis, you treat it incorrectly, and somebody passes away. You don't want that.
Yeah, life-threatening type thing.
Exactly.
But so you've got to look at the risks and evaluate the risks. Most companies have risk assessments. They already have a governance process for managing risk, pulling the AI process into that risk model and saying, okay, where are high-risk areas in the company that we need to manage and oversee? And you might turn around and say, you know what, one of our high risk is maintaining our secret formulas of our products. Okay, let's just say that that's one of them. Okay, then you've got to say, okay, we need to decide who gets to see that and how does that AI model get to inform that? Because what you don't want to do is put that information in your AI model and then somebody gets access to that or uses it inappropriately, changes something, and it screws up your products and your output or your quality of your products. So you've got to have a business process in place around governing that. So what that means is starting out with guiding principles around how are we going to manage AI, who owns the information, and the process. What does the process look like? What are we going to do with this information? What are our limits? And so this is where you take not only put your AI, I'll call it models and what you're doing in your use cases and embed that in your risk management framework, but also embed it in your policies and procedures inside your company.
All right. So where does all this fall? Does this fall under business? Does this fall under IT? Because that's the conundrum, right?
Yeah. And so really what you're going to want to do is have it fall under the business owner. So if we're talking about manufacturing information, who's making the decisions? Put it that way. Okay. I hate to use the words business and IT because IT is business too. They're not just mucking around. They're doing work too, I think. But
we would hope.
Yeah. But who's responsible and accountable for the decisions that are being made out of it? So if it's a analysis of customer information, it's probably going to be your head of business development who's going to own that process and information. Just like they own their CRM system, they're going to own the output of the decisions that are being made. But it's more about making sure there's some guidelines and you used the word guardrails earlier. There's 2 levels of guardrails like we were talking about earlier. This is also guardrails around what do we do with the information and how do we use it? How do we decide who gets access to it, who doesn't? What are you going to do with the information? How are you going to use it? Who's the audience? You got to think through that. Just like when you put any system in, you got to go, we got to set up security. We got to set up controls. That's what this is all about, security controls.
Okay. So all that being said, if we put all these things in place that we talked about, right, is making sure that your data and information is accurate and timely, making sure that you're ring fencing it correctly, making sure that you have the right guardrails in place, making sure that you understand, are you going to kind of, quote unquote, for lack of a better term, this model, is it going to be internally hosted or hosted in a secure environment in the cloud? Making sure that folks own not only the information and the data, the source, but the answers as well, and be responsible to teach or correct, right? If the student is making mistakes, making sure that there's ownership so that people can correct that, making sure the student has the latest information and data to learn what's happening in the company. Sounds like if you do all of that, it truly reduces the chances of a hallucination.
Yeah, and you bring up one other good point that we didn't probably touch on hard enough when we talk about training the models. The other piece of it is providing that feedback to the model.
Oh, it's the constant feedback loop. No different than what you and I do to our employees. It is an instantaneous, constant feedback.
Right. Provide feedback to the model. This answer was incorrect. Now, who provides that feedback? You need to, again,
be very careful. Otherwise, you get the bias.
You don't want the accounting people providing feedback on production procedures. Or maybe you do. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
just depends on who they are.
Yeah.
All right. Well, really appreciate it, Bill. Any closing any closing comments as we kind of wrap this up and let our two listeners go back to what they were doing before they decided to download this podcast?
I think the big question here, and what we're trying to really address with this whole thing is, don't be afraid of AI because of hearing about the hallucinations. But we also advocate for our clients to approach AI in a very smart way. Our last podcast, we talked about this, and I'll just touch on this real quickly. When you're diving into AI, have a good strategy, have some good use cases, know where you're going and what you're trying to do. So many times, companies try too hard to solve too big of a problem, and it becomes a long project. Figure out where high impact, easy wins, get those along the way. Again, the one frustrating thing I think people are finding in the market, and this is why we're advocating for internal development and ownership of models, we're finding a lot of companies, and we talked about this in a couple articles, are finding that the off-the-shelf tools aren't meeting their needs, so they're having to do things in-house. And this is all going to help be a competitive differentiator. There's a path to getting in there. And it's not unlike a lot of the work we've done in the past around helping companies innovate and come up with new ideas. I would just say, if you have questions and want to talk to us, you're concerned or just want to know more, email peter@trenergy.com, or you can email me, bill@trenergy.com. And if you're selling anything, don't email either one of us. We're not buying anything. We're just management consultants.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening to this podcast. Yep. Hopefully you found it useful, and you all have a great day.